Planning to Communicate Genesis Part 2. Some examples. In this lecture, I'm going to provide 3 examples of strategies I've used in teaching Genesis on the collegiate level. These examples may or may not work in your context. As noted in the previous lecture, so much of how we end up communicating God's Word is dependent on our audience, our time, and a host of other factors. The examples I offer in this lecture come from the strategy I used in teaching a 2-week intensive course on the book of Genesis to undergraduate students with a background in biblical interpretation and theology. Course sessions were interactive and discussion-based. I normally gave a short lecture on a particular topic, which would lead into broader class discussion that focused on the text and interacted with readings done outside the classroom. Example 1. Creation-Evolution Debate. When teaching an intensive course, it isn't always possible to cover every topic. When teaching Genesis, particularly the creation narrative, there's also an expectation that we will be covering the creation-evolution debate in some way, shape, or form. The creationist movement has been quite influential over the past decade, with organizations like Answers in Genesis, various apologists, or other prominent endeavors like the development of the Creation Museum highlighting the significance of recognizing God as creator to the Christian faith. Despite this expectation, I choose not to address the debate in my classes on Genesis until much later in the course, if at all. Part of this relates to the time I have in the 2-week intensive, but the driving force is really the purpose I have in teaching the course. I want the students to focus on the text and to understand its theology deeply before they dive into issues of a more apologetic nature. By treating the creation narrative without emphasizing topics normally associated with the creation-evolution debate, such as the meaning of day in Genesis 1, I am able to focus students in on the broader narrative of Genesis 1 through 3, the theology that emerges from that section of the text, and how God's goodness and benevolence are conveyed in the narrative, as well as helping students think through the connections between the creation narrative and later Israelite thought related to the tabernacle, the law, and the Sabbath. I'm not opposed to the creation-evolution debate. However, I have found that I am better able to create a simple, unexpected lesson that students really care about and can be embedded within a story that sets the stage for the rest of the course I'm teaching without dealing with the creation-evolution debate. In other words, by not treating the debate early in the course, I get to set a particular tone for the rest of the class. I am sure there will be ways for me to cover the creation-evolution debate and accomplish something similar. However, when we communicate, we are generally required to make choices. Strategy, even communication strategies, involve a narrowing of a range of possible actions. We can't do everything all at once. Example 2. Rearranging the order of the story. This example is strongly related to the knowledge of the students that I normally have in the classes I teach. They have a solid background in biblical and theological studies and have a good working knowledge of the storyline of Genesis more generally. They are also interested in understanding the book of Genesis deeply. Understanding these aspects of my audience, I have sometimes used a difficult passage from the later chapters of Genesis to heighten student interest and to make them more aware of how different pieces of a narrative fit together. For example, I may turn to a more problematic passage like the Judah and Tamar narrative. We read and discuss it before delving into the various aspects of the covenant or the challenges that the various patriarchs face in bearing children. I have also used the narrative of Shechem's violation of Dinah in this manner. In either case, students have a different goal: figure out how this odd narrative fits in the overarching narrative of Genesis. Again, I think this technique disrupts their expectations for the course, as well as connecting with them on a more emotional level and giving them something to really care about. A puzzle to solve. Example 3. Identifying the narrative tension. As I mentioned with regard to the story in the previous lecture, I believe that living in the tension of the narrative is extremely important. In the course of our discussion in class, I consistently ask students to identify the narrative tension. What is the real problem here? For example, if we look at the narrative in Genesis 34, 1 through 31, which has the subheading of the defiling of Dinah in my ESV, it would initially appear that the defiling of Dinah is the real issue at hand. Reading the whole of the narrative, however, yields other, broader tensions that take on more prominence in the narrative than the horrible act of Shechem. Shechem's desire to marry Dinah and Hamor's suggestion of intermarriage creates tensions in relation to the seed line and the preservation of the covenant community. The actions of Simeon and Levi put Jacob and his sons in jeopardy with the other people in the land. In the end, there seems to be no real justice for Dinah and no clean resolution to the situation. In fact, Later on, the anger of Simeon and Levi is cursed, and Simeon and Levi are divided in Israel. In this instance, what happens to Dinah is both tragic and far-reaching. More than an instance of sexual assault, Shechem's actions against Dinah do not simply impact Dinah. Instead, the whole of Jacob's house is affected and the preservation of the covenant testimony put in jeopardy. Again, these examples are just that, examples. I often change the way that I teach and continuously attempt to find better ways to communicate with students. These examples may not work for you in your context. I've also included some examples in this course in which I employ a method set forth by Erwin Lutzer in his class, How to Make Sermon Preparation Simpler, that may be more closely related to your context. My goal in offering these examples is to provide you with some ideas for how you might engage your own audience, as well as an implicit encouragement not to be afraid of being a bit unconventional in the way you communicate with your audience.